Tonight we'll delve deep into the turbulent and unsavory realities of the Middle Ages. Perhaps you picture feasts and banners, but most days back then were spent enduring the night in agony. Honestly, you probably wouldn't last a single day, so before you relax, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, of course. Only if you genuinely enjoy my content. Leave a comment below with your location and current time zone. It's always fascinating to see global viewers gather here. Flip your phone face down. Set it to silent mode. Now begin. Like many vast and terrifying things, this story begins in profound silence. It originates from the vast, parched steppe seas of Central Asia. Imagine that heavy stillness, endless rolling earth stretching beneath a vast, unforgiving dome. For centuries, this land guarded a secret core, bacteria, a microscopic symbiotic pact between fleas and rodents. That bacterium, an ancient, brutally efficient life form, later named Yersinia pestis by us, not a monster in its ecosystem. It was merely life's norm, a stable link in the cycle, cruel yet utterly natural. Its primary habitat was the bloodstreams of countless burrowing rodents, the true inhabitants of the steppe. Gerbils, jumping mice and their kind weld in sprawling subterranean cities. Their numbers fluctuate with seasonal shifts and population dynamics. Plague rages year minus round. The low hum of death never ceases. Its transmission mechanism is simple yet deadly. When fleas bite infected rodents, the blood they consume carries lethal bacteria. Within the flea's gut, the bacterium multiply at astonishing speed, forming a thick, gelatinous blockage in the foregut. The flea, driven mad by relentless hunger, bites with desperate, insatiable ferocity, yet cannot swallow due to the blockage. Each blood meal forces the plague sludge directly back into the new host's bloodstream. The cycle repeats. Infected rodents develop swollen, painful lymph nodes. High fever and septic shock follow swiftly. They retreat into burrows to die. As the corpse grows cold, starving fleas, carrying plague bacilli, abandon the body, seeking the nearest living host for warmth. Typically, they parasitized another marmot within the same colony. Thus, the plague lurks and spreads within these vast reservoirs of hosts, like an underground fire, concealed, unpredictable, and scarcely affecting human activity. For centuries, this grassland guarded its secret, but the world never truly stands still. In the early 14th century, two vast, unrelated forces began to shatter this fragile equilibrium. First came climate change. The earth was gradually cooling. The stable warm period, historically known as the medieval warm period, was giving way to the exceptionally harsh cold spells of the Little Ice Age. This chill swept across the steppe, causing chaos. Prolonged drought parched the grasslands, and rodent populations plummeted, forced to congregate around dwindling water sources. This brought normally isolated species into unusually close contact. Then torrential rains flooded burrows. Survivors were forced into mass migrations across open plains. Regardless of the scenario, the outcome remained the same. The plague cycle was violently disrupted. Fleas, deprived of their traditional hosts, were compelled to lower their selectivity. Any warm-blooded creature that ventured into their territory, camels, goats, horses, or fur hunters seeking rich ibex pelts, all became their targets. The once impenetrable microscopic barrier between the animal and human worlds now grew dangerously thin. The second pivotal force came from humanity itself. This was the era of Mongol peace. Descendants of Genghis Khan ruled the most expansive terrestrial empire in human history. Their domain stretched from the Pacific to the Polish border. Though their conquests were brutal, they ushered in an unprecedented era of stability and exchange across Asia. The fragmented Silk Road transformed into a secure, unimpeded superhighway. The logistically adept Mongols established a relay system of staging proofs, stocked with fresh horses and provisions, enabling messengers and caravans to travel at astonishing speed. Caravans now traversed the continent in months, not years. This new globalized world became a marvel of commercial and cultural exchange, carrying China's silk, India's spices, Persia's ideas, but also uninvited guests. Caravans laden with treasures also carried grain. Wherever grain went, rodents followed, especially the black rat's rat USA creature, perfectly adapted to human society, agile climbers, and prolific stowaways. These rodents harbored fleas. One flea, born on the dying body of a rat near Lake Chusky Skull in present-day Kyrgyzstan, now embarked on an epic journey hidden within sacks of wheat, leaping from rodent to rodent, traveling with caravans, advancing inexorably westward toward a continent, unaware of its silent bacterial passenger and utterly defenseless against it. The deadly secret had already been revealed, spreading through trade networks as a slow motion catastrophic pace, weaving through the world's most intricate commercial networks, reaching China in the 1330 seconds. By the 1340 seconds, it traversed the trade hubs of Samarkand and Tashkent. By 1346, it had knocked upon Europe's door, ready to unleash its power. This encounter unfolded in the jewel city of Crimea Kota. Today we call it FEODUSIA. Mid-14th century, it had become the Republic of Genoa's most crucial strategic outpost. Genoa's merchants, alongside their arch-rivals from Venice, dominated Mediterranean trade. As pivotal hubs, they linked Europe and the East's abundant riches through exceptional logistics. Cathay served as their gateway. This fortress port on the Black Sea was once a bustling international metropolis. Italian merchants, Armenian traders, Greek sailors, and Tartar nomads haggled over goods here. Fleets laden with silk, spices, and grain set sail from here toward Constantinople. Then, onward to every corner of Europe. This city functioned as a pivotal funnel within the global commercial network, channeling Eastern wealth toward the West. Yet this flow of riches was inherently bidirectional. In 1345, the city's prosperous routine was shattered. The valiant Khanjan Ibek of the Golden Horde, the symbol of Mongol power in the region, launched a siege against Cathay. The essence of this conflict was a familiar tale: trade disputes and religious tensions intertwined into a deadly poison. Giant Ibek's Mongol army, a vast, disciplined force of cavalry and engineers, encircled the fortress of stone walls. For the Genoese garrison, it was both a terrifying nightmare and a familiar scenario. With ample supplies and sturdy defenses, they could theoretically resist indefinitely by controlling the seas. The siege dragged on until 1346, a brutal stalemate punctuated by raids, skirmishes, and bombardments. Mongol forces deployed massive siege engines, catapults hurling boulders at the walls. Genoese defenders patched breaches and countered with ballistae. They bided their time. The stalemate became a contest of logistics and will. Yet the tide suddenly turned. No terrifying foe arrived unnoticed. It feared neither Mongol discipline nor Genoese walls. Plague spread along Mongol supply lines, ultimately invading the encampment. Amidst the dense ants that ravaged with terrifying speed, soldiers unharmed at morning roll call, by noon burned with fever, by night had breathed their last. This Mongol iron cavalry, once dominant across the world, began to crumble from within. Those proud horsemen who swept across the steppes, unconquered, were helpless against this invisible foe. The siege gradually unraveled. Daily bombardments shifted from sporadic to intermittent, until they ceased entirely. The besiegers became the besieged. The Genoese within the walls of Cathay witnessed this transformation. Their hearts stirred with both relief and dread. They saw funeral pyres blazing, and heard the dying groans of an entire army. They watched power vanish like smoke. Johnny Berger, consumed by the rage of defeat, could not capture the city, but he could make its defenders suffer as his own men had. So he issued a new, cruel order to the catapult operators: cease hurling stones. Instead load the swollen, blackened corpses of comrades ravished by plague. By modern standards, this was not a sophisticated biological warfare strategy, but a pure and vicious act of terror. Battalion Notary Gabriela Duce heard this account from fleeing survivors. He recorded, when the giant catapults hurled rafts laden with corpses toward the walls, The bodies flooded into the city like a torrent. The Christians had nowhere to flee, no escape from this catastrophe. Though they cast corpses into the sea whenever possible, the rotting remains swiftly polluted the air and poisoned the water sources. Yet the physical destruction wrought by this bombardment was perhaps limited. The true harm lay in the psychological shock. More crucially, the biological threat, a danger the Mongols had failed to fully anticipate. The real menace did not stem from foul air or poisoned water. The true weapon was not the corpses themselves, but the microscopic passengers clinging to them, and the slightly larger passengers attached to the corpses, clothing on bodies. Each rotting corpse that fell within the walls brought a fresh wave of infected rats. More deadly still were the starving fleas seeking new hosts. Though the Genos sealed the gates against the Mongol horde, they could not stop enemies the size of pinheads. Plague had already seeped silently into the city. Panic swept through the streets. The garrison that had bravely resisted the Mongol army was now helpless. Their minds were consumed solely with escape. The siege had ended. The Genos abandoned their hold on Cathay, crowding desperately onto merchant ships in the harbor, fleeing this dying city at all costs, longing to return to the safety of their homeland. They knew not, nor could they know, that they had become carriers of the plague, no longer merchants, but messengers of death. That cargo, more deadly than silk or spices, was now sealed tight within the ship's planks, about to embark on a journey across Europe. The voyage from Cathay to Sicily was like a floating nightmare. Imagine the scene aboard these Genos warships. Narrow hulls propelled only by oarsmen and a single sail. The cargo holds dangerously overcrowded. Sailors, merchants, and a few desperate refugees who had fled the city crammed together with the cargo. And of course, the rats nesting in the granaries, the rigging, and the holds, scurrying ceaselessly. At first, all seemed normal. The crew felt a grim sense of relief. They had escaped. But then the first patient appeared. Sudden fever, chills and exhaustion, before other symptoms emerged. He might be accused of carrying the plague. Swelling in the groin or armpits was the key sign. Those enlarged lymph nodes the Italians called gavosioli, dark reddened, tender to the touch. They gradually swelled to the size of eggs or apples. Soon after, purplish minus black spots would appear on the skin, signs of subcutaneous bleeding. Then the patient would fall into delirium or cough up blood, perishing within days. Then another sailor fell ill. Another collapsed. In the cramped confines of the hold, the plague spread with terrifying efficiency. The healthy forced to labor alongside the dying, nowhere to flee, nowhere to hide. The rhythmic chant of the oarsmen would eventually be drowned out by the groans of the sick. The deck became a house of death. Sailors perished suddenly in their single stalls aft. Bodies lay where they fell. The survivors, a band of terrified skeletons, struggled to keep the vessel afloat. Fear clouded their reason. They realized with horror they had not escaped the plague, only sealed themselves and the disease within the ark. Among the many ships fleeing Carthage, some vanished without a trace. These ghost ships, their crews all perished to the plague, drifted aimlessly across the Mediterranean, until they ran aground or were torn apart by storms. Yet some vessels, driven by sheer luck and desperate will, continued their voyage. Over a dozen ships, half minus human, half minus ghost, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, passed through uninfected Greece, and crossed the Ionian Sea, with bows pointed straight toward Italy. Their destination, the port of Messina in Sicily. October 1347. The people of Messina watched the Genos fleet approach from the harbor. This familiar sight should have brought joy. The arrival of merchant ships meant supplies, news, and wealth. This bustling port served as a crucial transit point to the Italian peninsula. Residents should have gathered at the docks to welcome sailors, unload cargo, and listen to tales of the exotic East. Yet as the 12 merchant ships drew near, an eerie sense of foreboding descended. No sound of activity on the decks. No sailors lined up along the bulwarks preparing to drop anchor. The vessels drifted into the harbor with an eerie sluggishness, as if ghosts. When the harbor mastered, officials boarded the first ship for inspection. They were met with a hellish scene. A pungent stench, the senses altered. Their senses a nauseating blend of disease and decay. The deck was strewn with dying and dead bodies. The few sailors still able to stand had sunken eyes like ghosts, their bodies covered in horrifying black swellings. They could barely speak, only weakly gesturing for help. The Sicilian port authorities were horrified, instantly realizing these ships carried not cargo, but some unknown and terrifying plague. To safeguard public health, the authorities ordered the expulsion of these vessels, swiftly dubbed ships of death. The GS fleet, laden with dying crew, was forced back out to sea, to drift aimlessly across the Mediterranean until every soul was lost. But it was too late. During those few hours the ships briefly docked. The curtain on disaster had already risen. First to slip away were the rats, sliding down the thick mooring ropes. They vanished into the shadows of Messina's warehouses and docks. Accompanying them were their passengers, fleas sated by the voyage. Their hosts were either dead or dying. The fleas abandoned the rats' cold corpses, seeking new warm-blooded hosts among the city's rodents. The exchange was complete. The bacteria had successfully crossed the ocean. A bridgehead was established. Within days, Messina's citizens might have felt the disaster averted. They had banished the ship of death. The peril seemed distant. Yet the plague swiftly engulfed the entire city, beginning with residents and laborers near the harbor. Dockworkers returned home with high fevers. Merchants' wives discovered excruciating swellings at their necks. The tragedy unfolding aboard the ships now replayed on a terrifying new scale. The plague spread with unbelievable speed, from one household to another, from one street to the next. Local physicians had never witnessed such a spectacle. Traditional remedies, bloodletting, poultices, prayers all proved futile. The plague seemed to mock their efforts. The healthy retired to bed at night, only to become corpses by dawn. Entire families were utterly wiped out within days. Panic evolved into paralyzing dread. People barricaded their doors, yet the disease seeped through the walls. Others fled the city, seeking refuge in the countryside. Unwittingly, they became carriers of the pathogen, spreading the plague to remote villages in Sicily, making the flames of this epidemic impossible to extinguish. Terrified citizens of Messina grew suspicious of one another, pointing fingers at outsiders, seeking scapegoats. Yet this enemy was invisible and silent, riding on coastal merchant ships and fleeing crowds. Spreading northward, along Italy's boot-shaped peninsula, the Black Death had descended upon Europe. The reckoning had begun. To understand this catastrophe, one must first recognize this killer. It was neither demon, nor divine punishment, nor miasma in polluted air. It was a living entity, a meticulously constructed, yet horrificously lethal carrier. Its scientific name, Yersinia pestis. This simple rod-shaped bacterium harbored neither malice nor grand designs. Its sole mission was relentless self-replication. 14th-century Europe proved the perfect breeding ground for its rise. Yet this microscopic predator did not rely solely on wind for dispersal. It required carriers a series of accomplices, each playing their role in the impending tragedy. The first accomplice was the oriental rat flea, scientific name, Zen Opsilla opus, barely larger than a grain of rice. This minuscule insect became the primary vector of the plague, bridging two worlds. The flea led a simple existence, feeding on its host's blood. When it sucked the blood of an infected animal, it ingested not just blood, but a viscous fluid rich in Yersinia pestis. Within the flea's gut, these bacteria multiplied at an astonishing rate, forming a thick gelatinous, filmless viscous substance blocked the valve leading to the flea's stomach. The flea's forget is now completely blocked. Hunger and agony intertwine. Unable to swallow, it is doomed to starve. Yet, in its death throes, it becomes Earth's most dangerous creature. Jumping from host to host, it bites with desperate fervor. Each bite attempts to feed, but the intestinal blockage prevents new blood from entering. Instead, suction pulls blood back into its own body, where it mixes with bacterial clumps. In desperate spasms, The flea regurgitates this pus-like slurry directly back into the bite wound. A single dying, obstructed fleek, and infect dozens of new hosts. Each bite is like injecting pure plague. This brings us to the second accomplice, the flea's preferred carrier and reservoir, the black rat. Scientific name, Rattus rattus. Not the common brown sewer rat of today, but the smaller and more agile roof rat. They excel at climbing and prefer high-altitude dwellings. Their dwelling places were not sewers, but the very backbone of human civilization. In the 14th century, they occupied farmhouse thatched roof, merchant attics, dark corners of granaries, and crucially the depths of ship holds. They lived mere inches from humans, sleeping, breeding, sharing food, body heat and filth. Between walls and rafters, an invisible parallel civilization thrived. When rodents perished from the plague, their carcasses became crawling breeding grounds for starving fleas. As the corpses cooled, these fleas sought the nearest warm host, cats, dogs, or most commonly, the sleeping human family on the other side of the wall. When Yersinia pestis completed its final leap from flea to human, it manifested in three devastating forms. The most prevalent form, which gave the plague its name, was bubonic plague. After a flea bite, Yersinia pestis did not directly invade the bloodstream, but traveled along the body's hidden waterways, the lymphatic system, ultimately reaching the nearest lymph node. These B-shaped immune self-fortresses were not defenses against invaders, they were traps. Bacteria rapidly overrun the lymph node, causing them to swell at terrifying speed. These swellings, called adenolymphadenitis, erupt in the groin, armpits, or neck, expanding to the size of eggs or even oranges. The swellings fill with thick, viscous pus, a mixture of blood and bacteria, accompanied by excruciating pain. Patients suffer from high fever, chills and vomiting. Dark purple patches bloom on the skin due to subcutaneous bleeding, known as petechiae. These dark spots viewed as marks of divine punishment, like he gave the Black Death its name. If the patient succumbs, death typically occurs within a week. The fatality rate of bubonic plague is terrifying. Infection fatality rates reached 60%. Yet the rare survivors, after their boils ruptured and drained, still endured a long, agonizing recovery. They were regarded as fortunate survivors. The second form was septicemic plague, a blood infection. This type sometimes developed from untreated bubonic plague. It erupted when bacteria breached the lymph node defenses and invaded the circulatory system. Additionally, fleas may directly inject bacteria into capillaries, completely bypassing the lymphatic system. Such infections do not cause swollen lymph nodes, but instead utterly destroy the body's defense system from the outset. Bacteria proliferate unchecked in the bloodstream, turning the circulatory system into a death channel. Symptoms are swift and brutal: persistent high fever, extreme weakness, intense abdominal pain. The bacteria rigor disseminated intravascular coagulation as microscopic blood clots form throughout the body. Abnormal bleeding occurs in the nasal passages, mouth, and subcutaneous tissues. With circulatory failure, the skin gradually blackens and necrotizes, giving the victim a terrifying, charcoal-like appearance. Sepsis plague leaves almost no survivors before death inevitably arrives. Often within a single day, the body doesn't even have time to mount a defense through swollen lymph nodes. However, the plague's truly apocalyptic transmission speed and contagiousness stem from its third form, pneumonic plague. This plague attacks the lungs and erupts when patients with bubonic or septicemic plague develop secondary respiratory infections. But its true horror lies in its mode of transmission. Once the plague invades the lungs, it no longer requires fleas or rodents as vectors. It spreads through the air. Infected individuals cough up droplets of bloody foam. Each microscopic droplet carries deadly Yersinia pestis bacteria. Anyone inhaling these droplets can contract primary pneumonic plague directly. This variant is the most contagious and boasts the highest fatality rate among all plague strains. Symptoms include fever, headache, chest pain, followed by coughing up bloody phlegm and steadily worsening respiratory function, until the patient suffocates on their own bodily fluids. Mortality rates not only reach 60%, but frequently exceed 90%, approaching the highest fatality records of any disease in human history. Death descends with relentless force, often claiming lives within 48 hours. Pneumonic plague enabled the pathogen to break free from animal hosts, to spread freely among humans. Every crowded room and every winter church service became a death trap. This unstoppable flood of plague became the final piece of the deadly puzzle. Its lethality, so perfectly engineered, it could subjugate an entire continent. In the autumn of 1347, this plague flood began sweeping across Europe. The point of invasion was not a grand battlefield or royal court, but the bustling, chaotic docks of Messina, Sicily. The pathogen's carriers were a fleet of over 10 Genoese merchant ships, limping home from the Black Sea port of Ca, a fortified trading post on the Crimean Peninsula. They carried silk, spices, and hidden stowaways. Plague minus infected rats and the fleas they carried. Italian chronicler Gabriele Dimas is recorded a legend Mongol siege engines hurling plague minus ridden corpses over cafes' walls, offering a dramatic early example of biological warfare. Though the event may have occurred, the catapults where rats had already infiltrated the holds. These rodents, drawn by the scent of grain and the promise of shelter, became the medieval world's natural fifth column. Genoese sailors believed they had escaped the plague-ravaging cafe, unaware that the seas of their doom lay hidden within the ship's structure. When the fleet entered the port of Messina, the Sicilians witnessed a horrifying sight. War ships resembling ghost vessels, crews either dead or dying, bodies covered in deadly black spots and painful swellings. Panicked port authorities expelled the fleet, but it was too late. Rats had already scurried ashore along the mooring ropes. Fleas found new hosts. The plague swept through Messina with a fury that shook the entire city. Friarish LP, as though the Franciscan order, chronicled this catastrophe. When the populace realized the deadly plague originated from the Genoese fleet, they expelled the ships from the harbor. Yet the plague lingered. The shadow of death was everywhere. Its transmission defied ordinary disease patterns. It preyed like a curse some fell asleep and harmed, only to be found dead at dawn. Within mere days, entire households were wiped out. This plague, originating in Sicily, spread along the Mediterranean's maritime trade route. January 1348, ships fleeing from the east brought the plague to Genoa and Venice, in northern Italy. These maritime republics, engines of European commerce, became major hubs of the epidemic. The plague spread inland from Venice. Along the Po River Valley, ships departing from Genoa carried it westward to Marseille, France. Whenever ships docked, the same pattern repeated. Ships arrived, sailors staggered ashore. Within weeks, port cities were engulfed by the plague. The disease spread northward from Marseille along the vital trade route of the Rhone River. By spring 1348, it had reached Avignon. Avignon was not merely a city. It was the seat of the papacy, the heart of Western Christianity. Pope Clement V, accustomed to political maneuvering rather than divine punishment, was horrified when half his entourage perished. As cemeteries filled to capacity, he consecrated the entire Rhone as holy ground, permitting Christian burial rites by casting bodies into the river. The Pope ultimately survived by barricading himself indoors for months. He huddled between two blazing bonfires. This desperate measure unexpectedly succeeded, and likely proved pivotal in dispersing the fleas. 1348, the plague's flames truly ignited, ravaging Avignon while penetrating deeper into France's heartland, by summer reaching the metropolis of Paris. Within a mere 6 months, the plague had spread from the Mediterranean coast to this great city, one of Europe's largest and most densely populated. Paris's densely populated parishes bore the brunt of the devastation. At its peak, the plague claimed approximately 800 lives daily. Meanwhile, the epidemic spread from Italy's western coast to the trading hub of Pisa. From Pisa, the plague once again set sail, infecting Corsica and Sardinia. After entering the Iberian Peninsula through the ports of Barcelona and Valencia, it swept like wildfire across the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. Within France, the plague had reached Bordeaux, a thriving port in the heart of Gascony, then under English control. Late spring 1348, the plague was poised to cross the English Channel. Bordeaux primarily exported wine, and the ships carrying wine brought death. Around June 24, the vessel docked at the small port of Malcolm, Leach now in Dorset. A sailor, perhaps feeling slightly unwell, stepped ashore. Thus, the Black Death landed in England. Initially, the plague spread slowly, quietly ravaging towns in the southwest, but by August, it had reached Bristol, a vital port with extensive trade links across the nation and to Ireland. In Bristol, the plague found a new hub for transmission, spreading along coastal trade routes and inland waterways at terrifying speed. Rushing up the Thames Valley toward London, the capital city of 70,000, was already shrouded in fear before the plague arrived. For months, rumors from the European continent had been spreading, including the death of Joan, daughter of Edward I, who succumbed to the plague while en route to Bordeaux to marry the Prince of Spain. Autumn 1348. The first cases appeared in the crowded, squalid parishes of West London. As the weather turned colder, the epidemic seemed to ease, bringing false hope, but this was merely a brief respite. The cold, damp winter of 1348-1349 provided ideal conditions for the plague to rage. In London's overcrowded dwellings, the plague no longer spread through flea bites, but via coughs and breath. By spring 1349, the plague erupted with unprecedented ferocity, devouring the entire city of London, and forcing the creation of new mass graves beyond the walls, spreading from the capital in all directions. Northward, it swept through East Anglia, devastating the kingdom's agricultural heartland. Northward, it crossed the Midlands, reaching the northern stronghold of York, by summer crossing the border into Wales, and arriving in Ireland aboard Bristol ships where the plague struck hard at the Anglo-Normans in their fortified towns, while the native Irish in the countryside were spared for the time being. The Welsh poet Gwilym Gwynnt likened the plague to dark seeds steeped in sorrow, yet he too ultimately fell victim to death's grasp. By late 1349, the plague had engulfed all of England, yet its ravages were far from over. That same year, it spread across the North Sea. One account, perhaps legendary, still chills the blood. A London wool ship drifted near Bergen, Norway. When locals rowed out to investigate, they found the crew dead, the hold piled with corpses. They carried the plague ashore. From Norway, the plague spread to Sweden, Denmark, and deeper into the vast territories of the Holy Roman Empire. It invaded Italy through the southern Alpine passes, and swept across France from the western Rhine. By 1349, Vienna, Hamburg, Cologne, and Bremen had fallen in succession. For the inhabitants of these regions, the plague's arrival proved almost more devastating than the suffering endured by the initial victims. For 2 years, tales of horror echoed in their ears. The faint hope of escape gnawed at their hearts. As the plague descended, hell's flames suddenly ignited. By 1350, this plague tsunami had engulfed most of Western and Central Europe. Now it violently battered Europe's northeastern shores, finally reaching the bustling Hanseatic lead trading cities along the Baltic coast. From there, the plague spread eastward, perhaps due to lower population density and less developed trade networks. Its advance through Poland and Bohemia was slower. In that cruel era, this offered but a meager consolation. Between 1351 and 1352, the plague finally invaded the vast Russian lands, sweeping through the trade hub of Novgorod, and delivering its final, brutal blow to Moscow. Within a mere 5 years, a single bacterium carried by a fleet reversed the entire continent along the arteries of human commerce and travel from the shores of the Black Sea to the fjords of Norway, leaving unimaginable destruction in its wake. It raced at the speed of ships, spread like caravans, transmitted through the intimate contact of human breath. This torrent proved unstoppable. feeding on the perfect nourishment of European cities until it's urged into a towering tidal wave. To question whether Black Death was so devastating is akin to asking why Mars ignites wildfires, Mars being your senior pestis, and the parched kindling was the medieval cities themselves. 14th-century Paris, Florence or London were not places of tree-lined boulevards and open squares. They resembled the intricate labyrinth of a human body. Life was compressed within the maze of ancient defensive walls. Streets were winding, narrow alleys, not designed for carts or horses, barely wide enough for one person or a mule to pass. The upper stories of timber-framed houses leaned out over the street. This cantilever design brought eaves nearly touching the opposite side, blocking sunlight, and perpetually shrouding the ground floor in twilight. This suffocating architecture brought a dreadful side effect. Stagnant air became the perfect breeding ground for airborne diseases. For modern visitors, the sensory assault here was overwhelming, with the olfactory impact being the most intense. In an era lacking public health awareness, streets served as open sewers. From rotting vegetable scraps to excrement from chamber pots, household refuse was casually hurled from windows, often accompanied by a perfunctory warning guard derived from the French guard, "Lo, watch the water." This putrid concoction, human excrement, countless piles of horse and cattle dung, slaughterhouse blood either coated cobblestones or churned through the mud of unpaved alleys. London's Thames and Paris's Seine were not sources of fresh water, but overflowing open sewers. Tanners dumped chemicals here. Slaughterhouses poured blood and entrails. This layer of perpetual organic waste became a paradise for black rats. A ceaseless feast allowed their numbers to swell to staggering densities. Rodents not only lived in close proximity to humans, but formed an intimate, symbiotic relationship. They bred in filth, while fleas thrived clinging to their bodies. Indoor conditions were equally dire. Typical urban families crammed into single rooms, often sharing space and rent with lodgers. These spaces were dark, poorly ventilated, and overcrowded. Floors lacked wooden planks. They were instead covered with rarely replaced straw or reed mats. These surfaces accumulated food scraps, filth, and parasites, creating an ideal warm habitat for fleas. When dying rats fell through thatched roofs, fleas tumbled down with them. Their next meal within easy reach. Confined quarters meant that once plague entered a household, it could sweep through the entire building within days. Pneumonic plague proved especially deadly, turning each crowded tenement into a death trap. A single cough from one family member could kill everyone sharing the room. Public health systems to address such crises were absent, and the germ theory concept would take centuries to establish. Mainstream medicine still adhered to the miasma theory, believing disease originated from foul air, toxic vapors, or mists laden with particles of decaying matter. Doctors buried their faces in bird-beaked masks stuffed with aromatic herbs, convinced they could filter the tainted air. Their treatments were built upon this fallacy, recommending people burn fragrant woods like juniper, or carry bouquets called bouquets of fragrances to dispel the stench. More tragically, they viewed the plague itself as a foreign entity to be expelled, while people reveled in feral scents. Fleas leapt freely, and bacteria spread unchecked. Hospitals of the time were not modern healthcare facilities, but charitable institutions run by the church, providing palliative care for the poor and dying. They were hospices, not rehabilitation centers. During plague outbreaks, these facilities became infection hubs concentrating the sick and dying, ensuring efficient transmission of the virus among caregivers and patients. The city's socio-economic structure further amplified its vulnerability. Towns acted like magnets, constantly drawing peasants seeking livelihoods or trade. They were hubs in vast commercial networks. Daily influxes of goods and people, wool ships from Flanders, wine barrels from Gascony, silk from Italy, each shipment potentially harboring stowaway rodents. The granary sustaining dense urban populations became fatal weaknesses, functioning as 5-star hotels for rodents, breeding massive, dense, well-fed vector populations. Take Florence in 1348. This Renaissance jewel, as a financial, artistic, and intellectual hub, was also a perfect urban powder keg. Eyewitness Giovanni Boccaccio recorded harrowing accounts in his memoir's preface. He painted a picture of societal collapse. Death on such scale shattered all social norms. He recorded corpses piled outside houses and carts traversing streets at dawn to collect the dead. He described thousands of bodies stacked like cargo in mass graves. He painted scenes of terror and despair. Brothers turned against each other. Uncles and nephews perished together. Siblings worked torn apart. Even husbands abandoned their wives. More unbelievably, parents abandoned their own children to fend for themselves. London's existing cemeteries were exhausted almost overnight. The city was forced to purchase land outside the walls as emergency burial ground during the 1982. Archaeologists excavating the East Smithfield site, they uncovered 5 layers of human remains, men, women, and children, arranged in orderly rows. This not only attested to the terrifying scale of death, but also highlighted the desperate, heroic efforts of the living to maintain order and dignity amid utter chaos. This medieval city, a symbol of progress, commerce, and civilization, became its own worst enemy. The very elements defining its urban character, population density, commercial concentration, and social networks, created the perfect ecosystem for the plague spread. This microscopic killer rode the chariot of fleas and rats along the trade routes forged during Europe's confident expansion. When the plague reached this continent, it found the dark, crowded yet vibrant cities not as fortresses, but as banquets. Facing this silently advancing enemy, European scholars pored over ancient texts and wielded scalpels, pouring forth millennia of accumulated wisdom, only to find it all futile. Physicians in long robes stood solemnly at the bedsides of the dying, seeing not disease, but a fundamental betrayal of nature's laws. Their understanding of the human body was rooted in an elegant classical system before Hume's theory of Dalen of Pergamon. Health is balance. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, each corresponding to an element and season, should maintain perfect harmony within the shell. Disease is merely a state of imbalance, a discord. Common fever stems from blood excess. Melancholy arises from black bile stagnation. Their cures followed their own logic, simply purge the excess fluids. But the plague's onslaught was no simple imbalance. It was a vortex of catastrophe that hurled the body into violent chaos and utterly overturned the Greeks' precise classification system. Though festering sores and skein, dulled by excessive melancholy, did they stem from the humours of melancholy and death? Perhaps so. Thus they sought correction, prescribing cheerful melodies, prohibiting melancholy thoughts, demanding patience focus solely on pleasant matters, as if sheer will alone could restore humoral balance. They opposed bathing, a medieval daily ritual, claiming hot water opened pores, making the body more vulnerable to foul air. Unclean cities exuded a deeper, more intense stench. The prevailing Nesmith theory, fascinating to scholars and peasants alike, held the plague clung to the air itself. As foul vapors rose from stagnant water, corpses, ominous stars, and even earthquakes. In some respects, this notion was astonishingly close to the truth, yet fundamentally flawed. People could indeed smell death in the air. Any town ravaged by plague was suffused with a stifling, sweetish stench of decay. Nowhere to hide. They thus reached the not entirely unreasonable conclusion that the odor itself was the killer. This belief, which inverts cause and effect, shaped the entire medical system and public response. Doctors paraded through streets carrying censers, elaborately crafted metal spheres filled with potent spices like benzoin, and cloves held before the nose. They created a bubble of purified air to dispel miasma. Towns lit massive bonfires in their streets, hoping smoke and heat would purify the atmosphere. Pope Clement V, fleeing the plague, spent the entire summer of 1348 in his grand palace at Anaya, curled between 2 blazing bonfires. His physician declared the flames purified the air flowing into his chambers. This was the survival strategy of the wealthy, attempting to build fortresses of clean air. The common people's defenses were simpler. They applied vinegar-soaked cloths to their faces, or carried pockets brimming with herbal bundles, erecting fragile barriers of fragrance against invisible toxins. As for treatments, when feverish, terrified patients were carried into clinics, their groin or armpit lymph nodes already swollen, like booboes. Physicians would open toolboxes brimming with polished metal instruments. The preferred and most common remedy was bloodletting. People then believed plague was a disease of damp heat, arising from excessive blood, so doctors would cut into a vein opposite the boil and drain the patient's blood into a bowl until they lay unconscious from fever and infection. Doctors acted with good intentions, yet they were draining the patient's vitality and life force, accelerating the very outcome they desperately sought to avert. When veins proved difficult to puncture, leeches were employed instead. These voracious creatures clung to the skin, sucking putrid blood. The plague earned its name from those massive, dark red swellings, the boils themselves, which became the primary target of treatment. These swellings were seen as the body's attempt to expel toxins. Thus, the physician's duty was to assist this process, which meant cutting open the boils. The physician would approach with a sharp, clean blade, a small act of motion, and incise the swollen lymph nodes. The procedure was excruciatingly painful. Immediately, foul-smelling pus and blood would gush forth. To further expel toxins, they would apply antidote plasters. These were far from gentle herbal dressings, but bizarre, oft unauguating concoctions of resonant lily root. In moments of desperation, they even resorted to ointments made from dried human excrement and figs. A popular remedy involved cutting open live pigeons and applying warm, bloodied pigeon flesh directly to the swellings, believing birds would draw toxins into their bodies. For the wealthy, the more bizarre the remedy, the less effective it was deemed. Prescriptions even included crushed jade, its exorbitant price symbolizing efficacy. The complex Roman formula triple toxin ointment was highly prized. This thick honey-based paste contained dozens, even hundreds of ingredients, including cinnamon, opium, and most famously, viper meat. Though hailed as a universal panacea and sacred antidote, it proved utterly ineffective against the plague. Goliath, the most renowned physician of the era, left candid accounts of medical impotence. As personal physician to Pope Clementine, he stood at the epicenter of the Avignon crisis, observing the plague through clinical eyes. He even precisely distinguished its two primary forms: bubonic plague, characterized by swelling and high fever, and the more deadly pneumonic plague, the latter spread through coughing, and claimed lives at a terrifying pace. The despair he conveyed remains chilling across the centuries. The plague was highly contagious. A single person could infect the entire world. He documented physicians too fearful of infection to visit patients, and even when they reluctantly made house calls, they were helpless. K himself contracted the disease, enduring 6 weeks of relentless fever and swollen, inguinal lymph nodes. He employed the medical practice of his time, incising the obsessed lymph node, and miraculously survived. He attributed his survival to divine grace rather than medical skill. He confessed this struggle was both futile and shameful. To avoid disgrace, I dared not waver in my resolve. Only through sustained fear did I preserve my life. This amounted to a declaration of utter defeat. Physicians were helpless. Medical texts offered no solutions. Medicines proved ineffective. Faced with the brutal reality of biology, the miasma theory and humoral theory were nothing but elaborate fictions. As doctors withdrew from the sick beds with hands stained by blood and ineffective herbs, people were consumed by a fear far greater than any fever. They gazed up at the heavens, seeking explanations on mercy nowhere to be found. When the most learned physicians could only inflict pain and poison, when the air itself became the killer, people naturally saw it as a force beyond medicine. This was no longer physical suffering, but the sickness of the soul. This was judgment upon the earth itself. From humble peasants to supreme monarchs, nearly all saw the Black Death as divine retribution. This was the day of wrath, God's own plague, the living embodiment of biblical pestilence. Humanity, through vanity, greed, and endless sin, had finally provoked the Almighty. The clergy's sermons, from former solace and redemption, they turned to thunderous condemnation. They denounced the vanity of fashionable attire, rebuked the moral decay of cities, lamented the ceaseless wars among Christian lords. Every sin, great or small, fueled the flames of divine wrath. Yet if this was divine retribution, the Church, God's representative on earth, proved utterly powerless to intervene. Prayers fell on deaf ears, chanting in cathedrals ravaged by plague proved equally futile. The sick received the last rites, yet death remained inevitable. Clergy themselves fell in catastrophic numbers, bravely tending the sick and dying, yet often succumbing first. In some parishes, clergy mortality approached 70%. This pastoral courage created a power vacuum, forcing bishops to ordain youths lacking even basic literacy. These untrained young men only lacked moral authority. The precipitous decline in clerical quality, they decay spanning centuries, eroded public trust and reverence for the Church, as the spiritual bastion of the Middle Ages was being hollowed out from within. The vacuum in authority and doctrinal interpretation gave birth to the most extraordinary and terrifying movement of the Middle Ages, the flagella NTS. This was not a new phenomenon. The practice of flagellating oneself as penance had deep historical roots, but the Black Death imbued it with apocalyptic urgency and terrifying scale. 1348, the movement appeared to erupt from Germany, a spontaneous, collective outpouring of guilt and fear, a hysterical catharsis. They formed processions, predominantly male, performing highly ritualized public acts of self-flagellation as they migrated between towns. Upon reaching town squares, they would form large circles, bare-chested, covered only from waist to ankles by linen cloth. As their leader chanted penitential prayers, the crowd began flogging themselves. The whips used were not crude branches, but leather lashes braided from 3 or more strands, each strand tipped with sharp metal blades. With each lash, these metal spikes stole flesh and blood. They whipped themselves rhythmically and relentlessly until their bodies became a gruesome, bloody mess. They would fall to the ground in predetermined patterns, sometimes falling the shape of a cross, while the leader continued the ritual, imploring God's mercy. Townspeople who witnessed this scene were filled with horror. These men who voluntarily bear the world's sins offer their blood as sacrifice to appease divine wrath. When plague ravages towns and church bells toll for the dead, the arrival of the flagella NTS brings the only glimmer of hope. They are welcomed by the people, provided with food and lodging, revered as living saints. Their blood-stained banners become the community shield. Yet this movement soon spirals out of control. The flagella NTS developed a distinct theological system, with hymns and self-proclaimed, divinely inspired leaders. They claimed that a ritual lasting 3.5 days, symbolizing Christ's time on earth, could wash away all sin. Salvation, they asserted, could be attained without priest or church sacraments. This was unmistakably heresy. They disrupted worship services and challenged local clerical authority. Under the guise of assembly, they migrated from plague-stricken towns to uninfected regions, unwittingly becoming the most perfect carriers of the very plague they sought to end. Pope Clement V, witnessing the spreading chaos from the Avignon Palace, quickly grasped the crisis's essence. He realized this revolutionary movement threatened the very foundations of ecclesiastical authority. October 1349, the Pope issued a papal bull, a formal decree condemning the flagella NTS, prohibiting their processions, declaring them heretics, and demanding secular authorities suppress them. By this time, public opinion had already shifted, yet the plague continued its relentless spread. The flagella NTS sacrifice proved ultimately futile. The fervor they had ignited had crystallized into suspicion and fear. They were no longer seen as saints, but rather as dangerous fanatics, vagrants and troublemakers. Those who had welcomed them now forcibly expelled them from the city. This apocalyptic movement self-destructed with astonishing speed, its members scattered back to their scarred homelands. This crisis of faith was profound and multifaceted. People did not cease believing in God, on the contrary. Their faith burned more fiercely and fervently than ever before. What truly collapsed was trust in the institutions claiming to interpret divine will. The Church had promised devotion. Prayer and penance were the paths to redemption and divine grace. Yet the plague raged and mercilessly devoured nuns and drunken sinners, innocent children and corrupt merchants. None spared. It even struck down priests at the altar. Such indiscriminate fury dealt a devastating blow to the spiritual realm, revealing a God not merely wrathful, but capricious and distant. Most terrifying of all was the sense of indifference. This trauma etched into the soul. This feeling of abandonment by the cosmic order became fertile ground for doubt. This scar was deeply imprinted on the soul of the Christian world, becoming a crack in the bedrock of ecclesiastical authority. Over the centuries that followed, the fissure widened relentlessly, until it shattered completely in the flames of the Reformation. The world lost its stability. Its rules became unclear. In this realm where physicians were powerless, and God remained silent, the terrified human soul craved answers, longed for an enemy it could understand and confront. Thus the quest for a new enemy began. People no longer sought sin, but sought sinners. They needed scapegoats. When heaven could not console, and earth could not heal, the fear enveloping Europe demanded a target. It needed embodiment, an incomprehensible, unprovoked assailant, an invisible killer whose terror was too abstract to bear. Terrified souls craved conspiracy, deception. They craved a concrete enemy they could confront and destroy. Against the social backdrop of 14th-century Europe, one group had been shaped over centuries into the ultimate of the Jews. Isolated by their faith, customs, and laws, they dwelled in ghettos, excluded from most trades, bearing the weight of religious propaganda that cast them as evil outsiders, the historical enemies of Christ. This panicked society projected its deepest fears onto this perfect canvas. Rumors quietly took root in southern France, spreading with the same swift, vicious ferocity as the plague itself. The accusations were simple and horrifying. Jews were accused of poisoning wells to spread the plague, plotting an international conspiracy to exterminate Europe's Christians. Spies were said to roam the towns, dropping deadly poison, allegedly concocted from spiders, owls and Christian hearts into the wells, rivers and springs. This narrative demanded the complete suspension of reason. It ignored the fact that Jewish communities suffered equally from the plague, their infection rates often higher, due to the overcrowded conditions and poor sanitation of the ghetto. But in the atmosphere of collective hysteria, reason is always the first casualty. This accusation provided a simple and satisfying answer to the horrifying question of attributing natural disasters or phenomena to human actions, thereby enabling punishment. Official investigations ignited the first wave of mass violence. In September 1348, the Lord of Chillon Castle on Lake Geneva arrested several Jews and tortured them for confessions. The medieval judicial system placed extreme importance on confessions. Though brutal, torture proved effective in compelling authorities to obtain the desired statements. After enduring horrific torment on the rack, a physician named Bolivinus confessed to orchestrating the entire conspiracy. He detailed the poison formula, named his accomplices, and sketched a complex web of conspirators. These coerced confessions were meticulously recorded, copied, as officially sanctioned evidence of Jewish guilt to other cities. The documents from Ireland became death warrants for thousands. News spread along the Rhine Valley into Switzerland and Germany, igniting waves of unimaginable brutal persecution. This violence was not random mob action, but systematically orchestrated by local guilds and city councils, who seized the opportunity to cancel debts owed to Jewish moneylenders and confiscate their property. This pattern repeated in Basel, Switzerland, January 1349. Hundreds of Jewish residents were rounded up, and driven into specially constructed wooden frames along the Rhine, where they were burned alive. Freiburg and Augsburg followed the same script, yet the Strasbourg massacre stands as the most chilling example of these deliberate killings. Though the plague had yet to reach these cities, panic and rumour had already swept through the towns. Merchant guilds, deeply indebted to Jewish moneylenders, demanded action against the city's Jews. Noble leaders initially attempted to defend and protect the Jews, but the mob, whipped into a frenzy by the guilds and itinerant preachers, could not be restrained. The old city council was overthrown, replaced by a puppet regime beholden to the guild's demands. On February 14, 1349, Valentine's Day, nearly 2,000 Jewish men, women, and children were herded to their communal cemetery, where a massive wooden platform had been erected. Those who agreed to convert to Christianity were spared. Their children were forcibly taken away, baptized, and raised as Christians. Yet the overwhelming majority refused to yield. They were bound and dragged onto the platform, which was then set ablaze. This massacre was executed with bureaucratic efficiency. Victims' property was distributed among citizens, and their debts were forgiven. Weeks later, the Black Death spread to Strasbourg and throughout the Rhine Valley, where tragedies repeated themselves. Despite early warnings, Cologne's Jewish community attempted resistance, only to be crushed and slaughtered. In the mining district home to one of Europe's oldest and most revered Jewish communities, the Jews likewise took up arms. In a desperate act of self-defense, they killed approximately 200 approaching Christian mobs. This only enraged the attackers further. Hordes of citizens poured into the Jewish quarter. The ensuing massacre became one of the most horrific events of the plague era. Over 6,000 Jews were exterminated, faced with the mob's deadly threats everywhere. Many Jewish communities chose collective suicide. In their final tragic resistance and declaration of faith, they set fire to the homes and synagogues, choosing death over slaughter or forced apostasy. Though voices of reason persisted, they were faint and few, easily drowned by the mob's roar. In 1348, Pope Clement V issued papal bulls, declaring Jews innocent of poisoning wells. He declared the plague divine punishment. Jews and Christians alike suffered the plague's ravages, and warned that any harm to Jews would incur excommunication. Rulers like Duke Albrecht I of Austria and King Casimir of Poland offered sanctuary, enabling Jewish refugees to migrate eastward to Poland and Lithuania, where they established Jewish centers of life that endured for centuries. Yet in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, the free cities of Germany and Switzerland, papal decrees were utterly disregarded. Local powers, boiling popular resentment and naked greed, proved far more potent than distant papal edicts. Though this persecution was merely a dark chapter in the long history of anti-Semitism, the Black Death endowed it with unique and terrifying intensity. It revealed how conspiracy theories rationalize irrational behavior. People preferred believing in vast networks of human evil, rather than acknowledging microscopic microbes or the elusive will of God. In utter helplessness, blaming Jews became an illusion of control. This transformed passive victims of disease into active participants in holy war. They firmly believed slaughtering enemies would purify their communities, cleanse their homes, and perhaps even appease a God who seemed to have abandoned them. Yet the well water could never be restored. Its poison stemmed not from human hands, but from a world that had fundamentally and irreversibly changed. The flames that consumed the Jewish quarters along the Rhine ultimately failed to halt the plague's spread. Instead, it etched an indelible stain upon Europe's so lay cold truth, revealing that the deadliest plague is not disease consuming flesh, but darkness feeding on fear, devouring souls. The world's tapestry of splendor seems to be unraveling, not torn apart by violence, but by each thread quietly slipping free. In towns once bustling with human voices, the deepest transformation was silence. The soundscapes of Florence or Paris once pulsed with life. Wheels clattered over cobblestones. Vendors' cries echoed in succession. Blacksmiths' hammers rang in waves. Distant church bells marked the passage of time. Now the bells toll for one purpose alone, and never cease. This monotonous death knell gradually becomes the new rhythm of life, until the living are no longer worthy of its sound. Even this sound will eventually fade, replaced by a silence heavy as lead. Fear thickens until it can almost be tasted in the air, a metallic soreness, like aged bloodstains. Giovanni Baudio, the Florentine chronicler who witnessed his homeland crumble, attempted to capture the pure psychological vertigo unleashed by this collapse. In the world he depicted, both divine law and human statutes had failed not because they were overthrown, but because no one enforced them, nor cared. He wrote of enforcers, no trees. Officials either perished, or dwindled too few to function. The result was a terrifying freedom. Anyone could act with impunity. For some, this meant sinking into primal, unrestrained hedonism. They lingered in ruined taverns, guzzling whatever liquor they could find occupied the vacant mansions of the wealthy, curling up in opulent chambers each week and month, living amidst lavish filth, until the plague's signature swollen lymph nodes appeared on their own bodies. They threw wild parties, convinced laughter, song, and wine were the ultimate antidote to the plague's gloom. It was a madness born of despair, a final dance upon the edge of the abyss. Others reacted in stark contrast. They shut themselves away, becoming hermits within their own homes, savoring the finest foods and wines with extreme restraint. Refusing to speak with the outside world, they turned a deaf ear to news of the sick and the dead, spending their days in music and prayer, constructing tiny, fragile bubbles of order within the chaotic cosmos. Still others chose the middle path, strolling through empty streets with bouquets of flowers or fragrant herbs in hand, pressing the blossoms to their noses, firmly believing sweet scents could dispel the pestilence's stench and death's gloom. To the plague, hedonists are indistinguishable from hedonists, aesthetes, or fragrant minus seekers. It devours all. The most sacred bonds, blood ties and familial affection dissolve, like salt in water. Paseo depicts with chilling precision brothers abandoning brothers, uncles renouncing nephews, sisters forsaking brothers, wives betraying husbands. Yet he writes that the most horrifying act, the most unnatural act, was parents refusing to nurse or care for their own flesh and blood, as if those children had no connection to them at all. Imagine that primal affection rooted in biological instinct and cultural inheritance, evaporating completely before the invisible terror. When a child falls ill and cries out for its mother in a house suddenly empty and silent, the mother, hearing the wails from the next room, will clench her heart, lock the door and flee to save herself. The sick are cast aside like worn miners out shoes. Only the rustling rats within the walls keep them company. If luck favors them, a hefty reward might tempt a servant to bring food, but more often they die alone. Commerce, the lifeblood of medieval cities, grinds to a complete halt. Workshops shut their doors. Masters and apprentices either perish or hide. The once minus thriving markets of Siena and Ghent now lie desolate as ruins. Weeds choke the stone crevices. Ships from Bristol and Genoa are rot in anchorage, their crews buried beneath the sea. Precious spices and silks still sealed in holds. Currency nearly worthless when bread cannot be bought. What use are sacks of silver florins? Doctors no longer make house calls. Priests cease administering last rites. The economy devolves to its most primitive form, survival. Disposing of the dead becomes a logistical nightmare. At first, tradition holds firm. Each corpse receives a coffin, a funeral procession, Christian rites, burial in consecrated ground. But the dead soon overwhelm capacity. Church cemeteries first overflowed, then collapsed. The solution was both brutal and inevitable: plague pits, gigantic trenches dug beyond the city walls. As night fell, men known as bikini arrived in carts, mostly criminals or desperate vagrants, with nothing left to fear, shouting, "Bring out the dead." Families dragged their loved ones' remains from their homes, abandoned before their doors. The bikinis piled the corpses onto their carts, men and women, young and old, rich and poor, noble and low, all stiff and contorted, jumbled together, forming a chaotic chaos of death. Upon arrival at the pit, The body's worst act in layers, just as Baggio grimly described lasagna. A layer of corpses, a layer of earth, another layer of corpses, another layer of earth, all dignity lost, identity extinguished. You were but a cold statistic. In Avignon, the papal city, the Pope declared the entire Rhone a sacred site, ensuring bodies cast into the river remained buried in holy ground. The river became a floating graveyard. The psychological trauma inflicted was immeasurable. People saw the plague as God's wrath, a punishment for human sin. Flagella NTS roamed the streets, lashing their backs until blood flowed freely, seeking to appease divine fury through self-inflicted penance. Yet they often only accelerated the spread of disease. As the plague ravaged towns, people turned on each other. Communities across Europe, especially along the Rhine and in France, sought scapegoat in their despair, directing their fury toward a familiar target, the Jews. Malicious rumors spread, claiming Jews poisoned wells to cause the plague. This was nothing but a fantasy born of fear and deep-rooted prejudice. Entire Jewish communities were annihilated. February 1349. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in their own cemetery. In Mainz, Europe's largest Jewish settlement, the rebellious Jewish community was crushed and slaughtered. These atrocities cast deeper shadows over the Dark Ages, revealing that when humanity succumbs to fear, its instinctive response is not unity, but mutual destruction. The world was not merely overturned, it lay shattered. Those fragments could never be restored, as the plague died out in one place only to spread to the next. The long silence finally began to fade. Survivors quietly emerged from their dwellings and hiding places, to gaze upon a landscape of devastation. In many places, they had become a minority. Of those who had welcomed the year 1347, less than half survived to see 1351. The world they inherited was desolate, yet full of opportunity. Walking through the streets, every third or fourth house stood empty. Its owners and kind vanished without trace. They saw fields stretching to the horizon, overgrown with weeds, clochers rusted and barren, manorial lords and their entire families buried in the same mass graves as the humblest serfs. This vast, silent void became the crucible forging the modern world. For the first time in centuries, resources were mismatched. Land was abundant, population was scarce. This brutal arithmetic overturned the very foundation of medieval society, the feudal system. For centuries, European society stood upon a rigid pyramid of obligations. At its base lay the serfs, the overwhelming majority of the population, bound to the land, forbidden to leave without their lord's permission. They tilled the lord's fields, exchanging meager shares of their harvest for the lord's protection and the scant plots that fed their families. This system depended on abundant labor and scarce land. The Black Death utterly upended this equation. Labor suddenly became a scarce and precious resource. Even if a lord owned thousands of acres of fertile land, without people to sow, cultivate, or harvest, the land was worthless. The surviving peasants deeply grasped this truth. They may have lacked formal economic education, but keenly sensed the tangible benefits of their newly acquired power. They had become highly sought after commodities. Farmers tilling ancestral fields on Kentish estates heard neighboring lords offering double wages or more, alongside promises of freedom. No more obligations, no more unpaid labor on the lord's land. A simple, clear contract, labor for money. And so, serfs voted with their feet for the first time, packing their meager belongings, leaving the land that had bound their families for generations, seeking better terms to maintain productivity. The lords were forced into competition. Wages soared for ploughmen, harvesters, and thatchers. In some regions, in the years following the plague, these wages doubled or even tripled. Conversely, livestock prices plummeted. Herds of unattended animals roamed the countryside. A horse that sold for 40 shillings before the plague could now be bought for less than 7 shillings. Farmers suddenly possessed the means to purchase their own livestock, lease their own land, and work for themselves. The shackles of serfdom began to rust and break. The ruling class and nobles and monarchs viewed this transformation not as a natural economic adjustment, but as a threat to the cosmic order. To them, social hierarchy was divine providence. Farmers were born to farm, lords to rule. The sudden empowerment of the lower classes was a sacrilege against the gods and nature itself. Their response was not accommodation, but legislative suppression. In 1351, King Edward I of England enacted the labour laws. This legislation was a stunning act of deafness. It sought to freeze all wages at pre-plague levels, prohibiting peasants from leaving their lords' lands to seek higher pay, while forbidding lords from raising wages. The act was essentially an attempt to turn back the clock, to recapture the economic genie by law and force it back into the bottle. It failed utterly. The decree proved completely unenforceable. The economic realities of supply and demand proved far more potent than any royal edict. Lords defied the law in secret, paying higher wages clandestinely to attract labor. Peasants, meanwhile, persistently resisted the ceremonial norms, attempting to restore the old order. The decree only intensified resentment. The peasant class saw its true nature, viewing it as a tool for the wealthy to hoard global wealth and deprive them of their rightful share. This anger simmered within them. Over the following decades, these tensions finally erupted. A new generation untouched by the plague grew up amid post-disaster prosperity and rising expectations. They were better educated, more politically aware, finding the old injustices increasingly intolerable. Preachers like John Ball traversed England's countryside spreading radical new ideas. When he posed the question, who were the gentlemen in the days of Adam and Eve, his arguments championed primordial equality, condemning the entire system of lords and serfs as a deception perpetrated upon the people. This pent-up discontent finally erupted in the summer of 1381, triggered by the implementation of the deeply unpopular poll tax. His argument championed primordial equality, condemning the entire feudal system of lords and serfs as a deception perpetrated upon the people. This pent-up discontent finally erupted in the summer of 1381, the peasants' revolt in England. The cause was the imposition of the highly unpopular poll tax. Led by Walter Taylor and others, tens of thousands of peasants from Kent and Essex marched on London. This was no rabble, it was a disciplined army. They presented clear demands: abolish serfdom, repeal the infamous statutes of labour, confiscate church lands. They seized the Tower of London, dragged the Archbishop of Canterbury and the King's treasurer from within, executed them by beheading on Tower Hill. For several terrifying days, they controlled the capital. The young King Richard I met with them, promising to fulfill all demands. These were nothing but lies. During the second meeting, Wat Tyler was assassinated. The uprising was brutally suppressed. Though defeated in the short term, its spirit continued to ferment. The old order had already begun to crumble. The commemorative economy, based on unpaid labor, was fading away. Over the following century, cash rents and the wage labor system would gradually replace the old order, becoming the precursor to modern capitalism. The Black Death did not single-handedly bring about this transformation, but it served as a powerful catalyst, accelerating a process that would otherwise have taken centuries. It wiped away the old structures, clearing the path for a new order. Yet as Europe struggled to rebuild from the ruins of the old order, attempting to stitch together a new socio-economic fabric, the nightmare returned. The Great Plague of 1347-1351 was not an isolated event, but the devastating prelude to a catastrophic process unfolding over the next 4 centuries. Yersinia pestis had established a permanent foothold in Europe's black rat populations and their flea hosts, becoming an epidemic that periodically unleashed devastating pandemics. Plague became a recurring character in Europe's living history, repairing like a spectre of terror every 10 to 20 years, cursing each new generation. The plague of Second Day in the 1360s proved especially deadly to children, followed swiftly by the Third Plague in the 1370s. The pulse of death never ceased. Each outbreak brought fresh trauma, ripping open old wounds anew, reminding all of humanity's inherent fragility. Though later plagues often became more localized, their ferocity matched the original catastrophes. The Great Plague of Seville in 1649 claimed nearly half the city's population, and this vital Spanish port never fully recovered. But the most infamous was the plague that swept through London in 1665. Since the 14th century, the city had swollen into a colossal beast. Narrow streets and timber-minus framed houses rolled densely. These teeming alleys became breeding grounds for disease. The epidemic began in spring and erupted in the slum parish of St. Giles. Authorities initially attempted to suppress the news, but the truth revealed in the official death record, the weekly register, could not be concealed. Death tolls continued to climb. 43 in May, over 500 in June, July, 6,000, August over 17,000, September, the epidemic peaked. Weekly deaths surpassed 7,000. The entire city plunged once more into a familiar nightmare, as if the horrors of 1348 echoed anew. The wealthy, including King Charles II and his court, fled to the countryside, abandoning the poor within the city walls. The mayor ordered a series of desperate public health measures. Affected households were quarantined and sealed off. Doors marked with giant red crosses and the words, "Lord, have mercy." Guards were stationed for 40 days, ensuring either the sick or the healthy could leave. This amounted to state-sanctioned cruel confinement. For families trapped inside, it often equated to a death sentence. As night fell, coffin carts traversed the streets. Crews shouted carrying the dead, a scene mirroring that of 3 centuries earlier. Daniel Defoe, then a youth, later a novelist, chronicled that year as an eyewitness. His historical novel masterpiece vividly recreates the atmosphere of fear and suspicion. He depicted the eerie silence on once bustling streets, Whitehall overgrown with weeds, the wails emanating from sealed houses, and the endless procession of hearses heading toward the plague pit at Aldgate. In 1665, approximately 100,000 people perished from the plague, and London equivalent to a quarter of the population at the time. The Great Fire of London that followed in 1666, though a catastrophe, it may have inadvertently hastened the plagues, and the flames consumed the rat-infested slum, allowing the city to be rebuilt with wider streets and brick houses. Yet between the first wave's fury and the smouldering embers of the second, a pivotal transformation quietly took root. The initial 14th century response to the plague was steeped in religious panic, fatalism, and scapegoating. Society seemed helpless. Yet through centuries of recurring plagues, humanity underwent a slow, painful, and oft unbrutal learning process. People began to fight back not through current flagellation, but through observation, organization, and public policy. The concept of public health was forged in the crucible of repeated plague outbreaks. The first major innovation was quarantine. Its principle was simple and logical: isolate potential carriers before they spread disease. The maritime republic of Ragusa, on the Dalmatian coast, was among the earliest practitioners. In 137, Chief Physician Jacob of Padua advised the city council to establish raid control mechanisms. The decree stipulated ships from infected zones must anchor at nearby islands. Current cargo required a 30-day isolation period before entering the city. This period was later extended to 40 days quarantino. This gave rise to the modern term quarantine. Venice, Ragusa's fierce commercial rival, swiftly adopted and refined this system. In 1423, they established the world's first permanent plague hospital, the Lazaretto, in an island in the Venetian lagoon. This facility, dedicated solely to isolation and treatment, was a revolutionary achievement for its time. By the 15th century, Florence, Milan, and other major Italian city-states had established permanent health institutions or health committees. These municipal authorities wielded extensive powers during plague outbreaks, enforcing isolation measures, regulating corpse disposal, prohibiting public gatherings, and deploying a terrifying new role, the plague doctor. These physicians, clad in long-beat masks, became enduring and harrowing symbols of the era. This attire may have been invented by 17th-century French physician Charles de Lamay, representing an early, unsettling attempt at personal protective equipment. The mask's long beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs, straw and mint, cloves, camphor, and other spices, believed to purify the foul air-spreading disease. Plague doctors wore long wax robes, gaiters, gloves, and wide minus-brimmed hats to minimize contact with the sick, and conducted non-contact examinations using long wooden staffs. These individuals were not always trained physicians, but often second-rate doctors or young men seeking high-paying adventure. As municipal employees, their duties involve more public administration than actual medical care, the latter being nearly impossible to achieve. They tallied the dead, witnessed wills, becoming the visible face of the state's epidemic response. Both revered and feared, they were the grim harbingers of death, yet also humanity's first organized, secularized representatives of public health crisis management. By the 17th and 18th centuries, these measures evolved into a sophisticated and brutal quarantine system. Sanitary blockades became routine. Entire towns or regions sealed off by armed forces, enforcing strict orders, with anyone attempting to cross the border shot on sight. The 1720 plague outbreak in Marseille, France, Western Europe's last major epidemic, demonstrated the ultimate power of modern state response. The plague arrived aboard a merchant ship from the Levant. Despite quarantine measures, the pathogen spread throughout the city. As the epidemic raged, the French government took unprecedented action. Authorities erected the eastern wall at a -meter high stone barrier guarded by soldiers, completely isolating Marseille and the surrounding Provence region from the rest of France. This measure proved remarkably effective. Although 100,000 perished within the quarantine zone, it successfully halted the plague spread. This brutal yet effective demonstration marked a major breakthrough in public health. Control measures no longer relied on prayer, but on borders, guards, and high walls. The recurring nightmare of plague, catalyzed by centuries of dread, compelled humanity to develop a crucial tool: quarantine, public health commissions, data collection, and state-mandated isolation. These formed the bedrock of modern epidemiology and contemporary pandemic response systems. The shadow of the Black Death lingered, bringing painful yet vital lessons. The air seemed to thin, tightened over the drumhead of mournful silence. When death finally subsided, survivors peer from beneath tightly shut eaves, squinting to adjust to the unfamiliar stillness. The world they behold has been reshaped into a house of bones. Psychological trauma runs far deeper than the loss of life. Such devastation, how does society digest it? How to explain this inexplicable cruelty? God's hand snatching children from their mother's arms, yet spares the sinner next door? The ancient answers, once whispered from the pulpit, gleaming from gilded Bible pages, now echo hollow lie. Divine will becomes a suffocating enigma. In an age where words of comfort fade, people turn to images. They begin to depict what they see, transforming fear into brushstrokes. Before the plague ravaged, religious art was mostly serene. Gilded ritual Christ on the cross symbolized sublime, sacred sacrifice, his suffering more symbolic than felt. Saints gazed at the heavens with blissful tranquility. But after the plague, a new, stark realism quietly seeped in. Suffering became real. Blood grew redder. Thorns grew sharper. Artists who witnessed friends, family, and patrons succumb to the plague could no longer depict the world through idealized strokes. Their creative focus shifted from heavenly promises to the grim reality of graves. This obsession with death gave birth to a peculiar yet powerful nuge on Ra, the dance of death. This was no celebratory dance, but a summons of mortality. On church walls, newly printed woodcuts, and in the most renowned mural at Paris's St. Minas Sulpice Cemetery, the dead come to claim the living. The imagery is stark and universal. Skeletons grin, fleshless yet vividly lifelike. Seizing the Pope's hand, his triple crown powerless to protect another skeleton leads away the emperor, his crown and scepter reduced to useless ornaments. The knight in armor, the merchant touching his purse, the beautiful maiden, the scholar holding sacred text, the farmer wielding his plough, even the infant in the cradle, all are dragged into this irresistible procession. This dance is the great equalizer, the only feast that knows no distinction. Death, the ultimate house treat. All guests treat all guests alike. This message is cruel and merciless, yet it brings a strange, dark solace to a traumatized populace. As the old hierarchy crumbles, the dance of death reveals a new, absolute truth. Wealth cannot buy reprieve. Piety cannot buy forgiveness. Power cannot command disease to bypass its target. This is a profound and subversive revelation. When serfs see death led away the king's portrait, farmers who labored their entire lives in bondage catch a glimpse of cosmic justice. This publicly displayed painting proclaims to all, whether clad in velvet or swathed in rags, all are but fragile skeletons awaiting the music's send. This theme echoes in psalms and the song of death. I shall pass away, becoming an apocalyptic lament across social strata, a collective meditation on life's fragility, a shared recognition of our common, dreaded fate. This fascination with death manifests in other forms. The triumph of death becomes mainstream. The grim reaper incarnates as a skeletal knight or a Sith Minus wielding spectre, sweeping across the earth with terrifying impartiality. In the monumental murals of St. Petersburg Cemetery, a Bat Minus winged skeleton crone swoops down to assault an unsuspecting aristocratic Dardan feast. Neither finery nor music could deter her descent. Funeral customs underwent a metamorphosis. Statues of nobles resting in peaceful slumber were occasionally replaced by tombs of transformation, their spine minus chilling twin minus their sculptures. The upper half carved to the earthly glory of the deceased bishop or lord, while behind the open arch below, the second statue was visible, a rotting husk, skin stretched taut over protruding shoulder blades. Sometimes maggots and toads crawl from hollowed eye sockets. The epitaph often reads, "What your eyes behold was once my form. What I endured shall become your future fate." This is death's monument, a warning carved with stone swords for the plague survivors. Life was no longer a gentle pilgrimage toward heavenly reward, but a desperate dance upon the edge of open graves. The art they created was this very symphony, gaunt and hurried, this profound cultural upheaval, this catastrophe that tore apart old belief, left not only scars, but also birthed a vacuum of thought. When the old world utterly betrayed its people, institutions hollowed out, philosophical systems exposed their flaws, new ideas inevitably surged like a torrent to fill the void. The Black Death was not the sole catalyst for the Renaissance, just as a single earthquake cannot shape an entire mountain range. Yet this catastrophe did shatter the foundations of medieval society along the cracks and fault line. New world views and ways of thinking began to sprout. Transformation began in the soil, not in thought. For centuries, the feudal system stood like a pyramid of obligations, solid and immovable. Its broad base was formed by serfs bound to the land, whose lives belonged more to the manor than to themselves. Above them lay layer upon layer of lords, knights and barons, culminating at the apex in the king. Yet the plague shattered this pyramid from its foundations. In an instant, Europe's most precious resource shifted from land to labor. When 1-3 to half the workforce vanished, survivors gained unprecedented power, lacking hands to plow, sow, and reap. Lords' vast estates became worthless. For the first time in generations, peasants gained the freedom to leave. They could abandon estates that had bound their ancestors for centuries, to seek better pay, more dignified conditions, a better life. The lords were naturally alarmed. This was not how the world was meant to operate. In 1351, England enacted the Labour Ordinance, attempting to freeze wages at pre-minus plague levels and confine laborers to their parishes. This effort ultimately ended in complete failure. The ordinance proved impossible to enforce. The market had sent a cue signal. The value of human labor would inevitably rise. Farmers who once earned 2 shillings could now demand 3. Roofers could even double their wages. This was not merely an economic adjustment. It was a revolution, with slow yet steady strides. It dismantled serfdom's shackles across Western Europe, giving birth to a new form of freedom. The freedom to sell one's labor to the highest bidder. This newly acquired wealth extended beyond the fields. In the towns, craftsmen and technicians also saw their fortunes grow. Once severely weakened guilds were forced to admit new members, shattering rigid, outdated systems. Inheritance issues were ubiquitous. The plague became a cruel yet efficient trade distributor of wealth. Entire families were wiped out, leaving mansions, shops, land, and savings to stunned survivors. Distant cousins or forgotten nephews might suddenly become estate owners. This torrent of capital surged into this upheaval of assets, overnight spawning a new aristocracy, shaking the foundations of ancient noble houses, empowering merchants, bankers, and traders, this emerging class more concerned with earthly profit than heavenly salvation. It was these figures who ultimately amassed vast fortunes, commissioned masterpieces of art, and the construction of architectural marvels, while supporting scholars rediscovering lost ancient knowledge. The Medici family of Florence, the greatest patrons of the Italian Renaissance, established their banking empire. In the turbulent yet dynamic economic climate following the plague ravages of the 14th and 15th centuries, the gold funding the dome of Florence Cathedral and the pigments adorning the Sistine Chapel trace their origins back to the graveyards of 1348. As another pillar of the medieval world, the church faced collapse. Its failure to stem the plague, or even adequately explain its causes, severely undermined its authority. Clergy abandoning plague victims, and the church peddling exorbitant indulgences to terrified sinners, bred deepened, enduring cynicism. The church's moral authority was thus shaken, though faith itself did not die, in some cases becoming more devout, more personal, more mystical. Blind trust in papal infallibility had been shaken. The spiritual vacuum provided fertile ground for new ideas. Philosophical thought, quietly nurtured among a few scholars, now found rich soil. Humanism did not deny God, but shifted the focus. It asserted that humanity itself, not just the divine, deserved study and celebration. It looked back to the glorious era before medieval scholasticism, seeking the splendor of ancient Greece and Rome, contemplating the wisdom of Cicero and Virgil, returning to the philosophical thought of Plato and Aristotle. It extolled human potential, individual achievement, and the majesty of the natural world. After the plague, this philosophy resonated profoundly. If life is so fragile and fleeting, why not live it to the fullest? Thus was born the spirit of carpe diem. Since pleasure, knowledge, and beauty all exist in this world, why wait for paradise in the next? Renaissance thinkers began constructing a new temple of knowledge. Its foundations lay in human reason, individual talent, and the survivors' profound awareness of the turbulent, terrifying, and beautiful world they inherited. The Great Plague cleared the land. Now, upon the ashes and bones, a new civilization begins to blossom. The vast silence echoing across that half-desolate continent would endure for centuries, reshaping not only Europe's art and philosophy, but its very biological essence. The Black Death stands as the most intense selective pressure event in modern human history, a brutal, continent-wide experiment in survival of the fittest. Its consequences still flow through the blood and bones of the survivors' descendants. This bacterium was not an equal killer, though its lethal efficiency was terrifying. It did not claim every life. A fortunate few possessed innate biological advantages. Subtle differences in their immune systems granted them a fighting chance. Survivors were more likely to pass these protective genes to their offspring. Through generations of change, Europe's gene pool was quietly and permanently rewritten. The most dramatic and extensively studied case is the CC, or 5-alpha-Tito gene mutation. This mutation causes a small deletion in the gene, encoding a protein on white blood cell surfaces, the very anchor point pathogens use to invade cells. The Black Death was not the first plague in history. This mutation likely existed at extremely low frequencies in human populations for millennia. Yet when confronted with the relentless onslaught of Yersinia pestis, this mutation conferred a significant survival advantage. Individuals carrying a single copy of the mutation showed enhanced resistance to infection, while those with 2 copies may have possessed even stronger immunity. Over the following centuries, as plague outbreaks recurred, this mutation became increasingly prevalent across Europe. It stands as a living genetic fossil, a mark etched into human DNA by that catastrophe of death. In a remarkable twist of biological fate, this ancient plague defense mechanism unexpectedly conferred a modern benefit. The CC, a 5 protein targeted by Yersinia pestis, is precisely the primary gateway for HIV to invade human cells. Today, a significant proportion of people of European descent carry the CC of 5-alpha-Tito mutation, making them highly resistant to HIV infection. Their medieval ancestors, in their struggle for survival against a devastating plague, unwittingly bequeathed to their descendants a shield against another plague 6 centuries later. The legacy of the plague extends beyond the biological realm and carries systemic implications. The plague laid bare the collapse of medieval medicine. Whether the 4 humours, the blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, or the miasma theory, mischievous air, were all proof an invalid. From bloodletting to purgative essence ointments made from pigeon droppings, these treatments were not only ineffective, but often hastened death. This catastrophic failure forced a slow and painful reassessment. Though old theories did not vanish overnight, a new, more evidence-based approach to medicine quietly emerged. Desperate physicians, seeking answers, defied religious prohibitions to perform autopsies. They urgently needed to witness firsthand how the plague ravaged the human body from within. These early, harrowing explorations marked medicine's shift from blind adherence to ancient texts toward a foundation of observation and dissection. More significantly, the plague gave birth to the concept of public health. Before 1347, individual health was solely a matter concerned only to family or clergy. The notion of the state bearing collective responsibility for citizens' health was virtually unheard of. Yet the Black Death's rampage compelled municipal authorities to act. In the maritime republics of Italy, where trade and plague converged, the first systematic countermeasures emerged. The city-minor state of Ragusa on the Dalmatian coast pioneered quarantine policies for incoming ships and crew. In 137, the city enacted a decree. All arrivals from infected regions must undergo a 30-day quarantine in designated isolations owned no outside the city walls before entry. This period was later extended to 40 days quarantine. Thus was born the term quarantine, still used today. As a maritime power, Venice further refined this system. In 1423, they established the first official quarantine station, Laserto, on an island in the Venetian lagoon Laserto. Ships were required to anchor offshore. Cargoes were fumigated with vinegar and herbs. Crew members were quarantined under strict supervision by the newly established Health Commission. These officials held special powers to close markets, prohibit gatherings, organize mass burials, and confiscate and burn the clothing and bedding of the infected. As the world's first public health officials, their model was swiftly adopted by cities across Europe. They managed sanitation facilities, controlled population movement, and attempted to trace transmission pathways. This rudimentary system often involved brutal methods and was based on partial understanding of transmission mechanisms. Yet it marked a historic turning point. Humankind no longer viewed plague as inevitable divine punishment, but as a common enemy requiring organized state action to combat. Isolation, health, and information became the 3 major weapons in this fight. The time required for healing population trauma far exceeded the transformation cycles of genetic structures and institutional frameworks. It took nearly 2 centuries and longer in some regions for Europe's population to barely recover to pre-Inus plague levels. This prolonged demographic vacuum triggered profound consequences. Chronic labor shortages drove up wages and catalyzed waves of innovation. When labor costs remained high, the incentive to develop labor-saving technologies intensified. Though Gutenberg's printing press, invented in the 1452, was not a direct product of the plague, its groundbreaking significance emerged precisely from this unique historical context. The high cost of scribes made mass producing books economically viable unthinkable a century earlier. The plague not only claimed lives, but reshaped the economic logic of the entire continent. Machines became more valuable, while human lives grew more precious. This plague never truly vanished. The Great Plague of 1347-1351 was merely the first catastrophic wave. Over the following 3 centuries, the plague returned with near-generational regularity, becoming a recurring terror in European life. It lurked like a spectre at every baptism and wedding. The Great Plague of London in 1665, the Italian Plague of 1629, the Great Plague of Vienna in 1679, and the last major outbreak in Western Europe at Marseille in 1720, each a devastating echo of death's catastrophe. Every new epidemic reinforced the original lessons, advancing public health, deepening psychological trauma, and reminding humanity how fragile civilization's foundations truly are. The Black Death was not an isolated event of the 14th century, but the dawn of a new and terrifying era. This long, dark age of plague only truly ended when brown rats carrying the mild black rat plague colonized Europe's sewers, and brick and stone structures replaced the wooden, thatched roof buildings that had once bred the disease. The plague's retreat was not a thunderous roar, but a fading whisper. Wherever it passed, the world had been utterly and irreversibly reshaped.